Die Hard. Is it still the most influential action film of post-1970s Hollywood? It certainly seems to be. Lots of movies get slapped with the label landmark, but it's hard to imagine one that deserves the moniker more than John McTiernan's 1988 action classic. Film historians may use Star Wars and Jaws as the universal dividing line between the pre- and post-blockbuster eras, and the aesthetic trends of certain genres are easily defined by terms like post-Matrix science fiction or pre-Lord of the Rings fantasy, but nobody holds a candle to Die Hard as a reference point of choice. It wasn't the first film to confine its action to a claustrophobic single location. It wasn't the first film to pit an outmatched lone hero against a team of bad guys, but every action film since has had to declare its place on the Die Hard measuring line. Is it Die Hard on a bus? Die Hard in a booth? Die Hard with a kid? Is it an anti-Die Hard with a non-central geography? Where does the hero fall on the John McClane metric of relatability? More schlubby, less schlubby, or just right like Bruce Willis? Hell, we'll talk about it more in a minute, but don't forget that Die Hard is the reason you think of Bruce Willis as an action hero, and Alan Rickman as a villain for that matter. In fact, consider just how much of action movie shorthand our shared cinematic language owes to Die Hard. If it didn't already exist, we'd have to make it just so everyone else knows what they're doing wrong. But how does the actual movie stack up after all these years? Now that hundreds of imitators, endless parodies, the almost immediate transformation of Willis from action hero mold breaker to master mold, 2 pretty decent sequels, 2 god-awful sequels, 3 decades of action movie evolution, and almost 30 years worth of hindsight, does Die Hard stand up? Does it still endure, undeniable initial impact aside? Was it really never actually as grand as its reputation? Or was it, but has that grandeur been irrevocably dulled by time, dilution, and... Hey, you guys, you know what my favorite Christmas movie is? Do ya? You're never gonna get it, cause it's a edgy post-meta-ironic choice. Do ya give up? Do ya? Give up? Okay, my favorite Christmas movie is Die Hard. Anyway, is Die Hard really that good? Really That Good is a show about getting deep into movies, and taking a while to do so if necessary, but it's not a show about bending over backwards to find new or radically different takes where none actually exist because the audience is expecting it, or a show about hitting a certain length because you did last time. Sometimes when you pop the hood on a classic movie, you find a space-age engine you never would have imagined was there powering the whole contraption with energies that border on the mystical, sure. But other times you just find the nuts and bolts. Expertly crafted, perfectly assembled, lovingly polished nuts and bolts granted, but nuts and bolts all the same. With that in mind, let us first acknowledge these splendid nuts and bolts. There's no silver bullet or magic secret behind why Die Hard is a good movie. It's a good movie because the people making it were good at their jobs. They had a good screenplay, and they made it better when they started filming. They picked a murderer's row of great and then mostly fresh-faced talent for the actors, dropped them into crackling dialogue exchanges and expertly crafted action scenes. Then they edited it into a lean, tight package that expertly plays its aesthetic presentation against the events it's depicting. Meaning what? Well, think about how Die Hard moves versus what Die Hard is about. In terms of narrative, it's a hostage thriller, a siege movie, a waiting game. The cops outside the Nakatomi building and the robbers inside are playing a grueling, methodical game of human chess that Hans Gruber deliberately drags out for hours on end, forcing everyone to sweat bullets. Even John McClane, who until Act 3 is playing for stealth. But the movie's presentation goes in the exact opposite direction. The staging is all about people locked into increasingly small geographic locales, but the camera and the editing are almost always moving. Diving, swooping, tracking, fast-cutting, even creeping. Meanwhile, instead of a deliberate, tension-stretching score that one might expect from a narrative mostly driven by people playing cat-and-mouse telephone tag, Die Hard's music goes for pounding, surging orchestral drive. Big horns, sharp stings, thundering percussion, and an insistent string section. Basically, what you have in Die Hard is a relatively mid-scale cop movie that's been shot, cut, and scored like an epic war film.
It the hard way.
And it's full of great characters. Every one of them is an archetype, but they're new archetypes, or at least spins on the famous ones. We'll save the big ones for last, so consider what a fun novelty it is that Hans Gruber's henchmen all have easily identifiable personalities, appearances, and names. You may not remember all of those names, depending on how many times you've rewatched the movie, but Franco, Tony, Theo, Alexander, Marco, Christoph, Yuli, Heinrich, Fritz, James, and Carl do all have personalities and distinctions in the greater dimension than henchmen are usually afforded. There's especially interesting stuff going on with Carl, but we'll come back to to Carl in a moment. See, Die Hard's narrative is all about the mechanics of its plot, and said plot is driven entirely by the actions and reactions of the people in it. As such, a lot of the supporting characters effectively exist as plot devices. Argyle the limo driver is there because the plot requires John McClane to go directly to the Christmas party from the airport without making any stops to establish any other Los Angeles contacts that might help him out later. Chief Robinson exists because someone with authority has to make bad decisions that require McClane to keep fighting. Ellis is only there because him selling McClane out moves the plot at a key point.
Hans, Bobby, I'm your white knight.
I must have missed 60 minutes. What are you saying?
And also because he's providing a goofus to McClane's gallants, but we'll come back to that. Agent Johnson and Special Agent Johnson are pawns of both the film's plot and Hans Gruber's. And Holly is a whole other issue that we're going to have to address down the line. Yeah. For now, what you should note is how these characters are memorable even though their function doesn't demand them to be memorable. Argyle is fun. Whenever the movie cuts back to him, we're glad he's still there. Robinson's ineptness works as comic relief, as does the blustery machismo of the Johnsons. And while Die Hard's employment of caricatured exoticism is another thing we'll be coming back to later, isn't it interesting decision that they make Mr. Takagi into a pretty stand-up guy, all things considered? Or that we get to see the crummy work environment that made William Atherton's dickhead reporter such a dickhead, or at least didn't help.
This is my story. I am going out there. Sam, all right, look, Sam, I tell you what. You don't want to give me a truck? I'll go and I'll steal a truck.
Hey, give us a break, Thornburg.
Eat it, Harvey.
And good old Reginald Val Johnson as Al Powell. Post Family Matters, it's become the most tired observation in modern film history that Val Johnson gets cast as a cop a lot, but how come nobody ever asks why? It'd be one thing if he just had a cop look and was always a background extra. That happens all the time, it's what central casting is for. But what is it about this actor that immediately makes his presence scream not just cop, but good cop, so perfectly that it works whether it's in a bit part, a supporting part, or 9 seasons in a leading weekly TV role? Well, think about the qualities you want in a cop when you need one. Friendly but authoritative, in charge but not a tyrant about it, welcoming and safe but protective and strong. Now, Val Johnson is a good actor whose range doesn't get nearly enough credit, but those qualities, he's able to embody those almost by birthright, and that's why he always looks good in that uniform. In a very real way, Powell is the moral center of Die Hard when you think about it, and you need an actor with Val Johnson's credibility to pull that off.
Hey, Roy, how you feeling?
Pretty fucking unappreciated, Al.
Hey, look, I love you. So do a lot of the other guys. So you hang in there, man. You hear me? You hang in there.
Anyway, on to the big guns. Speaking of legacy, influence, and how long ago 1988 really was, did you know that Hans Gruber was Alan Rickman's first major Hollywood role? Well, it was. Think about how distinctive a presence he's become over the decades, and then realize that until this moment, movie audiences worldwide had largely never heard this voice before.
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
But it's not just Rickman's dulcet tones that make Hans one of the all-time great movie villains. Everything from the script to the staging to the costuming are pulling double duty on making this character memorable, even though we never learn all that much about him. And Rickman's ability to express all that through performance makes this one of the best debuts in Hollywood history. Really That Good is all about cases where it's easy to miss how well something has been achieved, and Hans Gruber is a perfect illustration of that. Everything about Hans is just slightly off. His suit is a little too loose-fitting to do what a suit is supposed to do on a man, fashion-wise. His refined accent doesn't quite go with his wiry, slippery environmental awareness. His body language says laconic, his mood says impatient. His haircut doesn't even look right on him. He's a giant ball of suspicious actions, in other words, creating a subtle undercurrent of something evil walking around just convincingly enough in human skin. Which is yet another interesting, seemingly counterintuitive element of the film, since the actual twist with Hans is that he's actually more ordinary than he presents himself.
After all your posturing, all your little speeches, you're nothing but a common thief.
I am an exceptional thief, Mrs. McClane, and since I'm moving up to kidnapping, you should be more polite.
And then there's Bruce Willis. If there's one thing time has managed to unfairly erase about Die Hard, it's that Bruce Willis was such an incredible outside-the-box risky prospect as the lead of an action movie. At the time the film was initially gearing up, his only 2 previous films had failed, and he was best known as the lead on the popular TV comedy Moonlighting and as a commercial pitchman for Seagram's Wine Coolers, a gig that was actually paying him better than Die Hard was, but that he declined to continue when he gave up alcohol.
I had my Seagram's Wine Cooler. Is it me I'm thinking? Of the drink I'm drinking.
I'm not even sure there's a proper analogy for just how bizarre this casting was in 1988. Not only was Willis mainly thought of as a comedian, he was the opposite of almost anyone's idea of a leading man, or an action hero. His entire appeal as an actor up to this point had been that despite having a relatively young star's energy and screen presence, he looked older. His default facial expressions exude a world-weary sarcasm, his demeanor is schlubby and worn out, he was already going noticeably bald. He probably would have looked a little too average and blue-collar to be an action hero even in the nitty-gritty 70s, and this was 1988, smack dab in the middle of the decade's love affair with implausibly muscle-bound action heroes like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jean-Claude Van Damme, Dolph Lundgren, and Sly Stallone. Huh. Lot of muscled-up, vaguely exotic European super specimens in that roster, huh? Who in Die Hard do they remind you of? But the filmmakers decided to take a big chance on Willis, and in doing so, they and he rewrote the book on cinematic action heroes for the decade and launched Willis himself as the vanguard of a new subgenre of everyman action guys, unquestionably planting the seed for actors like Michael Keaton, Keanu Reeves, Nicolas Cage, Matt Damon, Robert Downey Jr., Liam Neeson, and Denzel Washington to be seen as viable on-screen ass-kickers in decades to come. His John McClane is such a perfectly realized self-insert power fantasy for the very audiences Die Hard was angling for that his presence and the filmmakers' use of it supercharged certain key symbolic and thematic elements already baked into the narrative, transforming a film that was actively trying to not be anything but a fun summertime distraction into not just a pop culture footnote, but a full-blown cultural landmark. Here's an idea that's absolutely going to become a recurring theme of this series. When a film truly hits big and makes lasting impact, not just at the box office, but to a degree that it truly becomes part of the collective conversation, it almost always is because it touched on something vital and meaningful in that moment in time. Not necessarily in the you had to be there sense, but in the nothing exists in a vacuum sense. Many films become great because they can't help but be imbued with the energy of powerful forces of history at work during the course of their creation, while others connect with audiences by delivering or speaking to an emotion they were deeply invested in at the time. Unfortunately, most people will mainly go on to remember and talk about their affection for such films in terms of what they felt, rather than how successfully the film presented and communicated those feelings to them. Said film's place in history, therefore, is often called unfairly into question, i.e. you only love Field of Dreams because it reminds you of your father, or Stand By Me is only memorable because it reminds dudes of their childhoods. Obviously, situations like those and many others are the whole reason that Really That Good exists, but I bring it up mainly to illustrate three sequential points. Firstly, most great films cannot be properly understood without also understanding the time period and culture they came about in. Second, therefore, Die Hard cannot be properly understood without also understanding the United States of America in the 1980s. Third, neither America nor American popular culture in the 80s can be properly understood without also understanding the presence and impact of one particular figure, Ronald Reagan, a one-time B-list Hollywood actor best remembered for co-starring with a chimpanzee, who rose to become President of the United States from 1981 to 1989. Now, this is not a political show, so it's not the time and place to do a deep dive into the endlessly debatable legacy of this two-term American president, though we do have to talk about it a little. Suffice it to say, he was an immensely important figure who held power and position during many key historical turning points at the tail end of the Cold War, even though, again, his actual role and the effectiveness of his leadership and policies during those turning points is, as I said, debatable at best. What matters for purpose of our discussion is the impact the Reagan years had on popular culture, because while historians will debate until the end of time whether Reagan was a truly great president, whether his policies were sound, how committed he actually was even to his own far-right conservative principles, or even if he was that masterful of a politician to begin with, since he only ever had to campaign against ineffectual wet blankets like Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale, what no one can deny is that Ronald Reagan was a spectacular cultural cheerleader. Reagan's politicking was all about crafting a modern mythology of a resurgent good old days America, casting the social upheaval of the 1960s and the more difficult morally gray struggles of the 70s as a time of darkness and discontent, with himself as symbolic of strong, old-fashioned, real America coming back to restore order and save the day. Now, in reality, Reagan, his party, and his backers in corporate America and the religious right primarily had a very clear idea of what that restoration meant. But his actual pitch to voters was always much more vague and general. His re-election slogan, Morning in America, cast his politics in the broadest possible metaphor of light, rebirth, and a new dawn conquering darkness. And he was a hell of a salesman for what turned out to be the perfect pitch at just the right time. Reagan's pep rally politics were infectious, both to otherwise non-political citizens and even to his direct political opponents.
A strange sort of trust and bond develops. We've had situations where the hostages have embraced their captors after their release and even corresponded with them in prison.
Even if you didn't agree with a single Reagan administration policy decision or didn't care, it was hard not to get swept up in the electricity of what was effectively a preemptive Cold War victory lap. The 80s in America was a decade of triumphalism, swagger, and backpatting. Our parties got bigger, our hair got bigger, cartoons got bigger, music got bigger, movie stars got bigger, food got bigger, all backed up by the blare of patriotic fireworks and the core Reaganist symbol of the old-school macho badass patriarch stepping up to set things right. And while Die Hard has even less in the way of overt politics than it does interesting things for Bonnie Bedelia to say or do, in fact, director John McTiernan deliberately went with the plot twist of Gruber's terrorist ambitions being a smokescreen for regular old robbery in order to avoid spoiling the fun by asking people to engage with the politics of terrorism on any meaningful level, Die Hard is soaking in the savory remoulade of Reagan-era return of the real American hero emotions, most of it communicated in the personage of John McClane and the way the film uses character archetypes and coded visual cues to play at presumed biases with the majority audience. McClane's generic flannel shirt, jacket, and jeans coupled with Willis's naturally hangdog demeanor communicate the image of a consummate everyman before we know anything else about him, and even when we do find out he's actually a police detective,
It's okay, I'm a cop.
well, that reveal is immediately undercut by the humorous reveal of the absurdly large teddy bear he's brought with him to Los Angeles. And look how badly he fits in among all the trendy, well-dressed revelers at the Christmas party, or even among the subtly Japanese-inflected architecture of the finished portions of the Nakatomi building itself. That's actually an important visual cue too. For all its nationalistic triumphalism, American pop culture of the 80s acted absolutely terrified of the handful of spots where the country wasn't doing so hot. And few subjects were as sore and politically loaded as the takeover of various American corporations and corporate real estate by Japanese interests, which here factors into making the very walls that will contain the action feel vaguely, well, un-American and most definitely alien when contrasted with McClane himself.
Hey! Merry Christmas!
Jesus. Fucking California.
Speaking of alien environments, let's not ignore that Die Hard takes place at Christmas, but in Los Angeles, and with apologies to Angelinos, a holiday whose key iconography is all about snow and winter playing out in a region that doesn't generally have either of those things will never not look strange and off-putting. Another spot where McClane, who is not from LA, represents tradition and old-fashionedness riding to the rescue. And speaking of Christmas and tradition, listen to what the film has Ellis, a character who only exists to be wrong about everything, say on the matter.
Harry, it's Christmas Eve. Families, stockings, chestnuts, Rudolph and Frosty. Any of these things ring a bell?
Actually, I was thinking more of mulled wine, an ice-aged brie, and a roaring fireplace. You know what I'm saying?
Meanwhile, McClane is in LA for the express purpose of reuniting his own nuclear family, bringing that ostentatious Christmas bear to his kids, and maybe convincing his wife to take his name back. Again, I'm not here to assert that Die Hard is an intentional or even unwittingly direct political metaphor. It's not. It's an action movie that's just trying to have a good time. In fact, the narrative aspects of McClane's old-fashionedness as a hero are present almost by accident. See, originally, he wasn't just going to be old school, he was going to be old, period, as in then 73-year-old Frank Sinatra. No, really. See, back in 1968, Sinatra played the lead in a pretty good, unusually gritty and realistic for the time cop movie called The Detective.
Prowling a city sick with violence, full of junkies, prostitutes, and perverts.
You're not gonna tell my parents, are you?
Did you know him?
They do not like living in garbage cans.
Joe, that's none of our business.
That's right, it's none of our business. Somebody doesn't do something about those garbage cans, you're gonna see the goddamnedest explosion is gonna tear this nation right down the middle.
Which was based on a novel by Roderick Thorpe. A decade later, Thorpe wrote a sequel called Nothing Lasts Forever, in which the hero finds himself trapped in a skyscraper with terrorists. When the movie rights for the book were optioned, the producers were contractually obligated to give Sinatra first dibs at reprising the character he'd first played. Only when Old Blue Eyes turned the job down did they begin retooling the hero into the younger John McClane and the movie into Die Hard, though most of the action and story beats from the book were preserved. But however it got here, Die Hard's central narrative of an old-school American hero kicking ass and saving new school from, well, itself at least in part, went hand in hand with a broader cultural bedtime story that America couldn't get enough of telling itself. On the other hand, lots of films have hit that momentary cultural sweet spot, but don't necessarily endure beyond the initial fascination. Die Hard did, even as the self-celebratory 80s that birthed and energized it faded into memory. That, you'd be correct, suggests that there's something else beyond raw filmmaking and zeitgeist capturing pop relevance that keeps it connecting with audiences. But what is it? For a movie about people who mostly communicate with bullets, bombs, or an unsubtitled German, Die Hard is an exceptionally quotable movie.
Welcome to the party, pal! Hans. Bobby.
Just like fucking Saigon! Hey, Slick!
I was in junior high, dickhead.
But what's the most memorable exchange of dialogue? I'm sure there are a lot of people with lots of different answers, but you have to imagine that the statistical winner would be this back and forth between McClane and Hans Gruber.
Yeah, I'm still here. Unless you want to open the front door for me.
I'm afraid not. But you have me at a loss. You know my name, but who are you? Just another American who saw too many movies as a child? Another orphan of a bankrupt culture who thinks he's John Wayne, Rambo, Marshall Dillon?
I was always kind of partial to Roy Rogers, actually. I really like those sequin shirts.
Do you really think you have a chance against us, Mr. Cowboy?
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
Okay, why is that so perfect? Well, it's great dialogue and the actors are doing a killer job with it, yes, but I also think it ties into a series of important tone and storytelling decisions that form the backbone of exactly why Die Hard works as well as it does. One of the most important story decisions any film will make is which perspective it's going to tell the story from. First person, third person, the characters, the authors, the audience, real-time, flashbacks, reliable or unreliable narrator. This is important stuff. For example, if you wanted to make Die Hard a much edgier, leaner, meaner, more visceral or unnerving film, that'd be easy. Just never leave McClane's perspective. Imagine how much that changes things. Now the tone is claustrophobic, your information is limited, you don't always know what's going on. Totally different movie. Die Hard does not want to be visceral or unnerving. The goal of everyone involved was to make a rollicking, enjoyable summer action movie, which, when you think about it, is kind of a strange tone to shoot for to begin with if you're talking about the story of a guy who wins but barely survives a violent encounter with armed terrorists. In real life, or even in most movies, you would not be having fun in this situation. But Die Hard makes it fun, and it does so without lowering the actual stakes at play or twisting itself into an outright comedy. Instead, it chooses to increase the audience's viewing pleasure by slipping them a potent drug. Power.
Now I have a machine gun. Ho, ho, ho.
Die Hard tells its story from an extreme third-person perspective where the audience is privy to multiple viewpoints throughout the story which provide them with almost all of the necessary information at any given moment. We see the story from McClane's view, Han's view, Hawley's, Al's, from the Johnsons, Thornburg's, the various henchmen, even from Argyle's point of view.
You listen to me, you little asshole. I'm a...
Asshole? I'm not the one who just got butt-fucked on national TV, Dwayne.
Now that's not in and of itself unusual. On balance, the majority of stories outside the mystery or building to a surprise ending genre grant the audience that kind of perspective. But think about what Die Hard does once it's given the audience that kind of godlike omnipotence. John McClane is our main character. The story starts and ends on his perspective, follows along the thrust of his journey through the events of the plot, and asks us to invest primarily in him. To that end, he has the most screen time, and any time we're cutting away from him to someone else implicitly has a purpose. There's an important reason that we are taking you, the audience, away from the hero. In Die Hard, that important reason is almost always to alleviate any semblance of dread, not tension, dread, or possibility of impending shock or surprise by providing the audience with information that not all of the characters are privy to. Almost every conflict and relationship in Die Hard is about who has leverage over who among the characters, usually in the form of information, but ultimate leverage is always with the audience. The terrorists and the LAPD are both unaware that McClane is a cop at first, but you know all along. Most of the characters don't know that Hans is pretending to be a terrorist, but you know almost immediately. The bad guy's getaway plan has already been neutralized even if they manage to defeat McClane, and nobody but you and Argyle know about it. Hans is going to blow up the roof and kill all the hostages, only he and you know that at first. The Johnsons are pretty much okay with major loss of civilian life. That's between you and them. You know the terrorist plan before McClane does. You know McClane's plan before everyone does. You know when the henchmen are coming for McClane. You know when McClane is coming for them. You know that McClane is actually armed walking into that final confrontation, and you know that the random escaped hostage McClane meets near the roof is actually Hans Gruber.
The fuck are you doing up here? What were you looking for?
I managed to get out of there and... well, I was just trying to get up on the roof and see if I could signal for help, you know. It's just from here. Why don't you come...
Oops. No bullets. fucking stupid, Hans?
Okay, that's actually an instance where they do choose to play the gotcha game. But otherwise, you know all that stuff. You are consistently better appraised of what's going on in Die Hard than any of the people actually in Die Hard. And that's how you turn a scenario that at first glance seems ripe for an, "Aw, geez, I don't know what's gonna happen next," nail-biter into an, "Aw, man, I know what's gonna happen next," theme park ride. Offering all the fun of sharing an exciting movie with a friend who hasn't seen it yet without actually needing to have seen it first. Or have a friend. And then, right in the middle of building up your omnipotent perspective, self-esteem, Die Hard decides to congratulate you for it. How? I already showed you.
Just another American who saw too many movies as a child. Another orphan of a bankrupt culture who thinks he's John Wayne, Rambo, Marshall Dillon.
What's happening in that exchange is a screenwriting sleight-of-hand trick that has gone on to be one of the most obnoxious and overused shortcuts in modern filmmaking. Having characters talk about obvious movie cliches and using it as an excuse to indulge in them freely, or worse, act like there's profundity in lampshade hanging.
Have an aneurysm, why don't you?
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex. Big no-no! Big no!
I'm a dead man.
Which there very seldom is. And if you're about to ask if Scream will ever be an episode of this series, no it won't. Because Scream sucks. Anyway, in 1988, this now incredibly tiresome metagag was actually pretty fresh and new, so it's all in good fun that Hans Gruber ends up perfectly describing the central narrative metaphor of his own movie. John McClane is a modern incarnation of the old-fashioned American cowboy hero riding to the rescue, and you know he's on the ball because both times it comes up, instead of disagreeing with him or dismissing him, McClane opts to assert his own superior knowledge of the genre.
I was always kind of partial to Roy Rogers, actually. I really like those sequin shirts.
Still the cowboy. Mr. McLean, Americans, all alike. Well, this time John Wayne does not walk off into the sunset with Grace Kelly.
This Gary Cooper asshole.
This exchange is the note on the napkin under the cocktail that Die Hard slides down the bar to its audience. A note that reads, "Hey, that thing Hans and McClane say about McClane being a movie cowboy? You were already thinking that, weren't ya? Yeah, I could totally tell. That means you're just as sharp and on the ball as the two sharpest, most on-the-ball guys in the movie. Yeah, you're a cool guy. We should hang out and do some sequels, man."
Benefits of a classical education.
Now, you might be inclined to call this pandering, but I really wouldn't. All entertainment is based on manipulating an audience, and Die Hard is being right up front with its relatively harmless intentions to establish a mutual admiration society between itself and its viewers. What's important for our purposes is that Die Hard does a masterful job of setting up, selling, and delivering what amounts to a fireworks display. Die Hard makes no illusions about what it is, and it does an exceptional job of being exactly that. Alright, put on a pot of coffee and let's sober up. We gotta talk about the places where Die Hard isn't quite perfect, because while really that good is a happy show, it's also an honest show. Firstly, you know why I put all that business about the Reagan era and its cultural influence right up front? Because I didn't want it anywhere near here, because I don't want anyone to think that this might be the sort of series that marks a movie down for its politics, intended or otherwise. Is Die Hard thematically a retrograde Reagan 80s power fantasy? Yeah, it pretty much is, but as Roger Ebert famously said, it's not what a movie is about, it's how it is about it. Also, while it's not a fault with the actual film, yeah, unfortunately, watching Die Hard in a post-Ferguson American media landscape casts Powell's backstory in a much more uncomfortable light. Now, it sucks because you can't blame the movie, but yeah, the idea that a cop shoots a kid because he mistook a toy gun for the real thing, and the big tragedy is the cop losing his nerve rather than the kid who lost his life, it sits weird now. In any case, the real deal stuff that inarguably does not work about Die Hard in and of itself can be summed up in one word: Holly. Holly doesn't work at all, and it's a problem that the only female character of any significance is basically a cipher who exists alternately as a plot device, problem to be solved, or prize to be won. We never really get much of her side of the story in the marital difficulties that have come between her and John. The film is only too happy to remind us that McClane didn't follow her to LA, at least in part, because he still had heroic police stuff to do back home. Her arc is all about being unfairly mad at John, to telling everyone how awesome he is.
God, that man looks really pissed.
He's still alive. What? Only John can drive somebody that crazy.
And then there's the tacky symbolism of Hans hanging onto her gold Nakatomi watch as they both dangle out the window at the finale, literally being pulled to her death by the token of her having chosen the path of career advancement over maintaining a traditional nuclear family with John. And she doesn't even get to undo it and send Hans plummeting herself. McClane has to do it for her. That would have at least given her character some sense of agency in the decision-making of her own life. Sure, you forget about it right away because it's followed by Hans having one of the top 10 greatest bad guy deaths ever.
That's not a hostage.
But it's still a bummer. Not because this or any other film has some kind of social obligation to afford equal complexity to female characters, though that might be a nice change of pace, but because having her be more interesting, more complete, and more dimensional as a character would have made what's already a good movie that much better. I mean, Thornburg actually gets more of a sympathetic inner life than Holly does. We know barely more about her reasons for moving on from McClane than we do about Uli's candy bar preferences. Sorry, Die Hard, you kinda slipped up in this spot. Perfect? Nah. But Die Hard is still about as good as action movies get. Those last two shitty sequels haven't tarnished its shine, the end of 80s optimism hasn't lowered its luster, and decades of knockoffs hasn't made it any less fresh, exciting, and vibrant. And even if you're not anywhere near on board with the macho Return of the Cowboy narrative or the shut up and let daddy save the day patriarchal myth-making, it's hard to argue that it doesn't work in context, and hard to hold it against a film that's working so hard to look like it's not working hard at all. Die Hard moves, Die Hard thrills, Die Hard plays, Die Hard has stood the test of time, Die Hard is really that good.